Murder is as old as time. And so is the quest to find the killers. And when sleuthing meets science, new forensic tools are born. In 1897 Chicago, the case of a missing woman would change the way that criminals are caught.
They found a few small bone fragments. The question was, were these animal bones or were they human bones?
The breakthrough, forensic anthropology, a way to uncover the dark secrets hiding in bones.
The bones, they don't forget, and they always tell the truth.
Forensic anthropology revolutionizes crime fighting, but a century later, it faces one of its biggest challenges: trying to unravel the horrifying crimes of a sadistic serial killer, known as the Killer Clown.
He probably killed close to 50 people.
December 1978. Police are searching for a missing teenage boy in Norwood Park Township, Illinois. Armed with a warrant, they begin to pull apart the home of a local suspect. But what begins as an investigation into a teenager's disappearance will soon expose something far more disturbing: the hidden lair of one of America's most notorious serial killers. 10 days earlier, 15-year-old Robert Piest vanishes from a nearby pharmacy.
He initially was seen at the drugstore by his mother, who had driven to the drugstore to pick him up. He went out the door, and after a length of time, the mother decided to go outside and see where the boy was at, and he was nowhere around. He had disappeared.
Earlier that day, witnesses had seen the boy talking to a local contractor named John Wayne Gacy.
Gacy denied any knowledge whatsoever of being anywhere around the young man or even talking to the young man.
At first glance, Gacy looks like a model citizen.
He was a community activist. He hosted all theme parties like 4th of July, and his neighbors thought he was the greatest guy around.
He was gregarious, and he also went to entertain kids, etc., as a clown. That's truly what he did, a lot of it. He was respected for that.
But behind the mask is a man with some very dark secrets.
John Wayne Gacy had a criminal history and actually had served time in the state of Iowa for sexually assaulting young boys. And the minute we heard that, we knew that we were probably focusing on Mr. Gacy as a suspect.
Gacy's criminal history makes him a prime suspect in Robert Piest's disappearance, and police hope it's not too late to save the boy.
We went to the house to look for Robert. We didn't know if he was being held a prisoner or if he was buried down there.
Police take Gacy into custody on a minor drug charge and thoroughly inspect his home. There's no sign of Robert, but someone notices an awful smell down below. The search quickly shifts to the crawl space under the house.
In the seal of the ground being broken, you could start to smell something disintegrating underneath the house. One of the detectives said, "There's something going on. It smells like the morgue."
Police brace themselves for the discovery of the missing boy's body, but that's not what they find.
They discovered what appeared to be bones.
But Robert Piest has only been gone a few days. Even if he's dead, these bones can't be his. As police keep digging, they exhume a complete skeleton. Then a second, and a third. It's starting to look like the man who dressed like a clown at kids' birthday parties might be a serial killer.
There's a photograph of one of the bodies, and they had uncovered the skull. And you could just see, even in the photograph, the absolute fear in that skull. And until the day I die, I will always remember the fear that I saw right then, which was probably whether or not a skull can have facial features like that. It certainly, probably not. It certainly appeared that way, as if it was the kind of fear that somebody being strangled while in handcuffs had.
I wondered if this was all for real. Like, never in our wildest mind did we ever think that this guy was a multiple killer.
It looks like Gacy has been committing murder on a grand scale. And this crawl space is his own private boneyard, full of faceless, nameless victims. It's clear that Gacy is the killer, but police want to be able to prove it. First, they'll have to figure out who these people were and what happened to them. And they'll do it by studying their bones. Dead men don't tell tales. But in forensic anthropology, their bones certainly do.
Forensic anthropologists are people who have spent their careers learning what there is to know about the recovery and analysis of human bones.
The earliest attempts to map the human skeleton go back almost 2,000 years to a physician known as Galen of Pergamon. He was the first person to clearly map the inner geography of the human body, including the skeleton. Doctors relied on the information he provided for centuries, but Galen actually based some of his observations about human anatomy on the bodies of animals, not people. In the 1500s, a doctor named Andreas Vesalius finally set out to create a more accurate picture of the human physique. Vesalius, the father of modern human anatomy, boiled away tissue so that he could literally assemble a skeleton, bone by bone, in his kitchen. But it wasn't until 1878 that Harvard professor Thomas Dwight realized that a person's bones could reveal specific details, such as whether they came from a man or a woman. In the late 19th century, that growing knowledge would help solve a crime for the very first time. May 1897, a woman named Louisa Lutgert is reported missing to Chicago police. Louisa's husband is Adolf Lutgert, better known as the Sausage King of Chicago.
Adolf Lutgert was one of the leading sausage manufacturers in Chicago, and he owned a sausage factory next to his house on Diversity Boulevard in Chicago.
Chicago Police Captain Herman Schuttler and a team of detectives press Lutgert about his wife's disappearance. But he seems strangely calm about it.
He suggested that maybe she just left home to go visit some cousins or other relatives. The police were pretty suspicious right from the get-go of Adolf Lutgert. They even noted that a year or two earlier, he had gone to the police when one of his dogs disappeared. But if his wife is missing, he doesn't bother to report it. That just seemed odd to the police.
But Captain Schuttler will need more than instinct to make his case. He questions the factory workers, wondering if they've seen anything unusual. Sure enough, they did. Before Louisa was reported missing, Lutgert was hard at work.
He was doing various strange operations in the middle of the night, running steam and chemicals into these vats. And the next morning, when his family woke up for breakfast, his wife, Louisa Lukert, was missing.
Captain Schuttler checks out the vats where Lutgert made his famous sausage, the same vats he was working with that night.
Adolf Lukert had told his employees that these vats in the basement of his factory were filled with this goo, and he didn't explain to them what this stuff was, but he just told them, "You've got to clean up the basement of my factory." There was still some of this mysterious brown, reddish fluid in the bottom of the vat.
And when police drain the remaining fluid and scrape the bottom, they discover something worrisome. A woman's ring. Maybe a female employee lost it while grinding meat. But as police continue sifting through the drainage, they find something else.
They found what appeared to be a few small bone fragments.
Lutgert claims they're just the remains of an animal ground into sausage.
The meat was brought in from the stockyards, and it was ground up into sausage right there at the Lukert sausage factory. So, you know, given that sort of situation, it wouldn't be that surprising to find some animal bones there at the factory.
Captain Schuttler isn't buying it. Unfortunately, he can't prove it. He's got no body and no evidence of foul play. His only hope? Find some way to prove that these are the bones of Louisa Lutgert. In 19th century Chicago, a woman's disappearance turns on a critical question. Are the bones found in her husband's sausage-making factory animal or human? In this era, even most doctors can't answer that question, let alone the police. So lead investigator Herman Schuttler calls in reinforcements.
He needed some expert help to figure out what all this stuff was.
The Field Museum of Chicago. In just a couple of years, it's already made a name for itself for having one of the biggest collections of bones in the world.
The Field Museum of Chicago is well known for having dinosaur bones and human skeletons and all sorts of anthropological exhibits.
And in these hallowed halls works a very unconventional scientist, anthropologist George Dorsey. Dorsey has traveled all over the world studying human remains.
He was one of the first people in the United States to get a PhD in anthropology, and was very familiar with being able to recognize the difference between, say, a bone from a pig or a cow or some other animal.
What Dorsey's hoping to do this time is much tougher. All he's got are these bone fragments. That's not much to go on as he tries to figure out whether they're human or not. Forensic anthropologist Douglas Ubelacher from the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History has worked with the FBI for more than 3 decades. And he knows just what Dorsey was up against.
This is a calvarium skull that animals had chewed off the face. It was found in Oklahoma and was thought to perhaps represent a human infant according to its bulbous shape. I didn't think it looked human. We did some testing of hair fragments that were found on it, and it showed a type of hair pattern consistent with cattle as well. So the question then becomes, what type of a young cow would have a round skull like a human? And it turned out to be a calf with a condition called hydrocephaly. And this is a documented example from Germany of a skull of a hydrocephalic calf that shows the same features.
Dorsey wants to eliminate any chance of error, so he compares the sausage factory bone fragments to every different kind of skeleton he can get his hands on. Everything from pigs to cows, and of course, humans. Each of these skeletons has some areas of structural overlap and some very big differences. But even if Dorsey knew for sure it was a human bone, there are 206 of them in the human body, and these fragments could have come from anywhere.
Well, the process that George Dorsey used was essentially to look at the bones that were found in the factory and figure out where might this piece of bone fit into this skeleton.
Today, more than a century later, forensic anthropologists still use Dorsey's hands-on approach. After carefully studying each fragment and comparing them to hundreds of skeletons, Dorsey has finally identified the bones. He concludes that some of the fragments are from a toe and a rib, but he has no question about their origin.
His conclusion was no, the only place that these bones would fit would be in a human skeleton.
Schuttler officially changes Louisa Lutgert's status from missing person to murder victim. And topping the suspect list is Louisa's husband, Adolf Lutgert.
Adolf Lutgert was really the only suspect that the police had. Some witnesses talked about seeing Adolf chase his wife around with a gun on one occasion. So that lent some credibility to the idea that he might have lost his temper finally and did her in.
Chicago police arrest Lutgert and charge him with his wife's murder, and the story instantly becomes a media sensation. Lutgert's sausages had become a sensation at the Chicago World's Fair, making him virtually a household name.
People are always interested when someone in a position of power is charged with a crime. But perhaps more than anything, it was both the gruesomeness of how Louisa Lutgert was supposedly dissolved and this underlying mystery of whether a murder had even happened.
It's a murder case with no body and no eyewitnesses. For the first time ever, prosecutors are hoping a few bone fragments can bring down a cold-blooded killer. A century later, in 1978, police on the John Wayne Gacy case aren't trying to prove murder. They're hoping to figure out who was killed and how. It all starts with the bones, the only thing that's left of the 3 victims found beneath the home of John Wayne Gacy.
My reaction was just plain, wow, you know, what have I uncovered here? It's something that obviously I had never seen. And it was just way too much for me even to comprehend at that time, to be very honest with you.
Gacy starts talking about luring young men to his home, binding or handcuffing them, and then strangling them. But he's coy. He won't admit how many victims met their fate here, or who they are.
Gacy told us only things that he wanted us to know. He actually did say at one point that we could never prove the case because he actually built his house on an Indian burial ground. This was part of his whole defense. I think he really did believe that we couldn't prove it.
But forensic science has come a long way since the days of the Sausage King. By the late 1970s, forensic anthropologists can do more than just distinguish an animal from a person. They can determine gender, stature, age range, and evidence of injury. And one of the legends in the bone field is forensic anthropologist Dr. Clyde Snow. He helped identify the remains of King Tut and Nazi angel of death, Joseph Mengele. Now he'll face his biggest challenge, putting names and faces to the bones found under John Wayne Gacy's house. And it's just the beginning.
Today, police find 4 more bodies in John Wayne Gacy's suburban home.
Each day, the medical examiner announces the discovery of more skeletons.
Literally, the hole in the floorboard became bigger. Days there became longer. The crime just seemed to become bigger.
It takes 2 months for a full excavation. The final tally is 29 victims. Police now have more than enough evidence to put Gacy away forever, but they're still trying to assemble the puzzle of Gacy's killing spree.
This was the first time that a forensic anthropologist had been asked to examine this number of bodies of victims from a single case.
There are so many victims that identifying every one of them could take months, even years. So first, police want to get an overview of Gacy's crimes and see if there's a common thread. Dr. Snow turns to the bones for help and starts with the most basic question of identity. How old were these victims when they died?
To assess age at death of juveniles, forensic anthropologists frequently look at the size of the bones. It provides some clues as to age. You can see the difference in size between this tibia of a child and the adult-sized tibia. But in addition, you can see how these bony caps on the ends of the bones of the growing child are separate. And as the bone continues to grow, these caps will grow right on out with that bone until they fuse, and then they look like that.
This is common knowledge for forensic anthropologists today, but it took over 60 years of research after the Lutgert case to determine the growth patterns of individual bones. When the bones fuse, that means they've stopped growing. And different bones stop at different ages. The hands and feet at about 15, the thigh bone at roughly 17, and the collarbone, the last bone to stop growing, at approximately age 28. When Snow checks the collarbones of the skeletons found under Gacy's house, none of them are fully fused. The first piece of the identification puzzle now falls into place. These victims were all less than 30 years old. The next question, what were the genders of Gacy's targets? First, Dr. Snow will focus on the size and shape of the femur, or thigh bone.
The head of the femur, the part that fits into the pelvis, tends to be much larger in males than it does in females.
This is a strong indicator of whether a skeleton was a man or a woman. Forensic anthropologists can also look to other bones for clues, like the pelvis. Females usually have a wider, rounder pelvis to accommodate childbirth.
And not only the pelvis, but also there are differences, particularly in adults, in the skull. Males, for example, have the very heavy brow ridges above the eyes here. They have big mastoid processes, this lump of bone right behind your ear, a number of differences, whereas female skeletons are more gracile, more delicate.
Police have recovered very complete skeletons, so Dr. Snow has enough markers to confirm each victim's gender. Based on these bones, the overall snapshot of Gacy's victims comes more clearly into focus. They're not only young, they're all male, like the boy who vanished from the pharmacy. Now, Dr. Snow looks for clues that will tell him their ancestral background. Ethnic features are less conclusive than the ones that show gender or age, but they do offer clues.
Those differences are reflected in the skeleton of the face.
And Snow notices these skulls share many similar characteristics. Narrow triangular nose openings, unprotruding jaws, and cheekbones that aren't very pronounced. These are all signs that point to the skeletons being Caucasian. Police now believe that all of the remains found in John Wayne Gacy's house are white males in their teens or early 20s. And they know for sure that this is no Indian burial ground. The 29 bodies in this basement were all left here within the last few years. But who were they, and where did they come from? Killer clown John Wayne Gacy isn't saying. So police will have to turn back to the bones for answers.
Investigators have found 9 bodies in 3 days of searching through John Wayne Gacy's suburban Chicago home. They expect to find at least 4 more bodies each day for the rest of the week.
Using just the bones found in the crawl space of John Wayne Gacy's home, forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow has created a profile of the serial killer's target of choice. Young, white, and male. But who are these victims? Their families are out there somewhere waiting for news. So police are going to try to find more answers by sending Dr. Snow back to the bones.
The bones, they don't forget, and they always tell the truth. Now, when they talk to us and they tell us their stories, some of them are pretty laconic. Sometimes we don't get very much information from a skeleton. Others they're kind of like people, you know, sometimes you can't shut them up.
In court, prosecutors will want to prove exactly how Gacy killed his victims. Gacy has admitted to strangling some of them, but he's not exactly a credible witness. So Dr. Snow checks a particular bone in the neck, one that usually controls tongue movement.
This is this little kind of horseshoe-shaped bone up in your throat, the hyoid. And with a fair degree of frequency, that bone becomes fractured during manual strangulation. Now, it can also be fractured by blows, occasionally, or even hanging, but most frequently it is associated with manual strangulation.
Based on what he finds in the hyoid bone of most of these skeletons, he's suddenly able to confirm without a doubt Gacy's gruesome method of murder.
We saw a general trend of his, which was the rope around the neck, and once he twisted that, they asphyxiated. For all practical purposes, the kids didn't have a prayer.
That broken hyoid bone confirms that many of Gacy's victims were strangled. But police still have no idea who they are. The Chicago police files are full of runaways who've never been found, and some of Gacy's victims could be from other cities. Fortunately, Snow's anthropological profile has already helped police narrow down the pool of possible candidates.
They compare it with missing persons, with their profiles, and that can lead us to candidates for eventual positive identification.
Police are getting hundreds of calls from all over the country from people who want to know whether a missing son or brother has been identified among the dead.
This will be a long, slow process. But long before the age of DNA analysis, and with no skin on their fingers to print, there's one last forensic tool for identifying victims: their teeth. Like bones, teeth can reveal a wealth of information, including age. The patterns of tooth eruption and wear can clearly show how old someone was.
This is a lower jaw, a mandible of a young child, and basically we can look at the stage of formation of these teeth and calculate the age more exactly than we can from looking at the length of the bones.
Experts called forensic odontologists can also tell from certain types of erosion whether someone is a smoker. A person's molars and incisors can even reveal how well off they were, based on the quality of their dental care. But when it comes to forensics, the best thing about teeth is that they help identify people. That's what the families of John Wayne Gacy's suspected victims are counting on.
Gregory's mother hopes he's still alive.
I really don't want to believe that.
On December 12, 1976, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik, an employee at Gacy's contracting company, disappeared after dropping his date off at her house. His car was found the next day, but Gregory was never seen again.
If they suspected their son might have been a victim of Gacy's, They would bring dental work from their dentist into the county morgue to do comparisons. So it was a difficult, tedious process.
With 29 bodies to identify, police have a long road ahead. And not every victim has dental records to match against.
After 6 weeks or so, we had only identified less than half of the bodies.
And 17-year-old Gregory Godzik is one of them, dashing the hopes of his mother, who had prayed he was still alive. And without fingerprints or DNA to help him, Dr. Snow could be out of options. But he has an innovative idea for trying to ID more victims. Snow and a forensic artist named Betty Pat Gatliff have been pioneers in efforts to put flesh on skulls, allowing them to see what victims looked like before they died. Snow and Gatliff began using facial reconstruction to identify plane crash victims back in the 60s. But around the time of the Gacy case, the method is getting perfected.
This is a sculpture done for a very specific purpose, not made to go in a museum or to look good. It's made to achieve its purpose of getting someone identified.
Every skull holds clues as to how the flesh folded around it, where the eyes once sat, and how wide features like the nose and mouth once were.
We're uniquely different in our layouts of our faces, and capturing that is what the forensic artist needs to do to trigger recognition. It's key.
One of the most critical steps in the process is to use simple vinyl eraser tips to establish the average thickness of the skin.
They are actually applied on various anthropological landmarks around the face. Then it becomes a matter of starting to connect those dots, starting to build up the soft tissue using clay to reveal what the contours might have looked like on the surface in life.
The skull doesn't give any clues about a person's hair or eye color, but it does show the more subtle features that forensic artists can replicate.
We tend to think that we recognize somebody we know by just their eyes or some individual thing, but in fact, what we really are doing is picking up on the layout, the spatial relation.
Now, police have finally given faces to 9 of Gacy's unidentified victims. But can they find the names to go with them? Soon they release the images to the media, hoping that someone, somewhere, will be able to recognize them. With Gacy's, at least police had full skeletons and clear evidence that they were dealing with a serial killer. But 100 years earlier, all police have are a few bone fragments and reports of a missing woman. There's still no proof that Louisa Lutgert is a murder victim, or that Chicago's famous Sausage King killed her.
The key legal question that came up is something called corpus delicti, where you have to prove the body of evidence that there was a crime. So the first question is, was there a murder? And some people in Chicago, and Adolf Lutgert among them, insisted that no murder has happened here. Louisa Lutgert just ran off.
Anthropologist George Dorsey tells a different story. He believes that Louisa was killed, and he's trying to prove it with a few stray bone fragments. Something no one's ever done before.
This was the first trial where anthropologists testified as expert witnesses. It was a huge sensation. It was similar to what you would experience today with something like the Casey Anthony trial or the O.J. Simpson case. Blanket coverage, around the clock, newspapers putting out extra editions, thousands of people showing courthouse trying to get into the trial because everyone wants to see it, so the audience area would be packed every day. And when George Dorsey testified, he came across as very credible, and he sounded very definitive when he identified these specific bones as being from specific parts of the human skeleton.
And then Dorsey goes even further. When he looked at the size of all the bones together, the rib and toe, he notes they are all smaller in comparison to the size of average male bones. His conclusion? The bones belong to a woman. And Louisa Lutgert was a woman of small stature.
The defense attorneys cross-examined Dorsey, but no matter how they tried to trip him up, he would not budge from his story.
The prosecution has made a compelling case, but they're relying on circumstantial evidence and an anthropologist who's never testified in a criminal case before. So the defense tries to remind the jury that this is just one expert's opinion.
So the defense attorneys kept hammering away at that, trying to have this doubt in the minds of the jurors.
Lutgert's team then counters the prosecution's star witness with their own expert, Northwestern University anatomy instructor Dr. Walter Allport. And after examining some of the rib fragments, he draws his own very different conclusion.
Dr. Allport looked at the same bones that George Dorsey looked at and said that some of these bones were from a hog.
Pig ribs and human ribs have similar characteristics, which makes Allport's assertion highly plausible.
Like many trials today, you ended up with warring experts on the witness stand. They were bringing out some various bones during cross-examination, and they handed some bones to him, and he looked at it and said they were from a dog. The prosecution pointed out that it was actually from a monkey, which prompted some laughter, and his way of trying to recover from this mistake was to say, well, maybe it was a dog monkey. At that point, the jurors are probably thinking this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So that really undermined some of the defense testimony on the bones.
Lutgert's defense is looking shaky, but the burden of proof is still on the prosecution. Yes, maybe those are human bones. But Dorsey still hasn't proved that anyone was killed, at least not yet. Dorsey has already established that some of the bone fragments were from a toe and a rib, but then comes a startling new revelation. Another fragment is part of the victim's skull. On closer observation, Dorsey notices a trace of the ear canal left on a piece of the bone, which means this is the temporal bone, a part of the skull located near the ear. The grisly discovery clinches the argument that this is a murder case.
If you lose the top of your little finger, you could still quite functionally be alive. However, if it turns out to be a bit that comes right from, the side of your head here, chances of you walking around alive are pretty slim.
For the first time ever, bones are used to help make the case against a killer.
The 12 jurors find him guilty. Instead of giving him the death penalty, which some people thought he deserved for committing such a gruesome crime, they sentenced him to life in prison.
A few small bones, a dedicated expert, and a prosecution willing to take some very big risks conspire to make history. The science of forensic anthropology has just proved its value, and it's about to make even greater strides. In 1936, forensic anthropology and law enforcement form an official partnership when the FBI reaches out to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History for assistance in solving some of their toughest homicide cases. In 1945, forensic anthropologists' expertise crosses into the battlefield, helping to ID the bones of unknown casualties from World War II. And in 1949, bone detectives take on their first serial killer, John George Hay, also known as the acid bath murderer. And by 1978, police hope that forensic anthropology can help close the books on the John Wayne Gacy murder case. Most of the 29 skeletons found under Gacy's house have been identified, but there are still a few unknowns. Forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow and artist Betty Pat Gatliff have used the victims' skulls to create facial reconstructions that could help their families recognize them.
It's your last shot. You've exhausted all normal leads or methods of getting leads for an identification.
At last, they get a hit on one of the anonymous skeletons. They identify a 15-year-old named Timothy McCoy. A teenager from Iowa, Timothy was returning home from a Christmas trip in January of 1972 when he disappeared from a Chicago bus station, 20 minutes from Gacy's house. Based on the date of his disappearance, Timothy McCoy is believed to be Gacy's first murder. Overall, forensic anthropologists put names to more than 20 of Gacy's victims. In a gruesome twist, police also find 4 more corpses in nearby rivers that forensic evidence shows to be Gacy's handiwork, including the body of Robert Piest, the boy whose disappearance first brought authorities to Gacy's doorstep. On February 6, 1980, Gacy stands trial for the murders of 33 young men and boys. The world of forensic anthropology has clearly come a long way since the days of the Sausage King. The bones found in Gacy's crawlspace are powerful and undeniable evidence.
The defense was ostensibly one of insanity, which was really the kind of defense that we expected. Pretty much the only defense that I think was available to him at that time. I was scared of it. You have to sit there as a prosecutor and say, wait, no jury in the United States has seen anything like this, so maybe they will think that this guy's got to be nuts.
While Gacy pleads insanity, prosecutors use the remains of his victims to weave a story of a sociopath who knowingly lured young men and boys into his home and ruthlessly killed them. With the bones of Gacy's many victims helping to mount the case against him, the verdict is no surprise.
Gacy was found guilty of all 33 counts of murder and was subsequently sentenced to death.
On May 10, 1994, Gacy is executed by lethal injection. Today, Gacy Street looks like any other. His house has been torn down, and the mass grave has long since been filled in. But the legacy of Gacy's case lives on, mostly because of how it launched forensic anthropology into the limelight. And this field has become even more powerful since then. Now, state-of-the-art tools like high-powered microscopes are helping forensic anthropologists find what they ever imagined possible.
It allows us to look inside the bones, and that produces information that's relevant to many areas of interpretation in forensic anthropology and may produce some exciting breakthroughs.
Technology like digital animation also allows forensic anthropologists to get more detailed information from old bones.
I've been able to scan these fragmentary skull elements and virtually assemble them using the input of a forensic anthropologist into the correct orientation to have a virtual skull. And in the past, I wouldn't have been able to do anything to help put a face on that skull.
Forensic anthropology is still just a century old. But modern-day bone detectives are taking the science to a level once thought impossible, solving murders and identifying the dead using nothing more than a victim's bones.